On a cold morning in February 1999, the city of Decatur, Illinois woke to the kind of winter stillness that makes every sound feel intrusive. Snow had fallen the night before, not enough to bury the streets, but enough to muffle the footsteps of early risers heading to work. The factories along the industrial corridor were already humming, shift workers pouring in before dawn. Decatur was a town built on labor, grain processing, manufacturing, the steady rhythm of blue-collar work that kept families fed and neighborhoods intact. By mid-morning, that rhythm would shatter. At 9:47 a.m., a 911 call came in from a modest apartment complex on the east side of town. The caller's voice was strained, panicked. Someone was hurt. An ambulance was dispatched immediately, sirens cutting through the quiet streets, drawing neighbors to their windows. When paramedics arrived at the two-story brick building, they were met by a woman in her 50s, shaking, her face pale. She pointed upstairs. Inside apartment 2B, they found her. 27-year-old Jennifer Lynn Harmon lay motionless on the living room floor. She was dressed in pajama pants and a sweatshirt, her dark hair fanned out around her head. There was no sign of a struggle in the room itself, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. But the bruising around her neck told a different story. The paramedics knew immediately there was nothing they could do. Jennifer was gone. Before we continue with this story, take a second to hit subscribe. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, we'd love to know how far these stories reach. This channel brings you true crime stories that refuse to let silence win, stories about people who deserved better, and the long, difficult road to truth. This is one of those stories. Jennifer Harmon wasn't supposed to die that day. She wasn't supposed to die at all. She was the kind of person who made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. Friends described her as gentle, thoughtful, the type who remembered birthdays and checked in when someone seemed off. She worked as a receptionist at a dental office downtown, a job she'd held for 3 years. Her co-workers adored her. Patients felt at ease the moment she smiled. Jennifer had grown up in Decatur, the youngest of 3 daughters in a working-class family. Her father had worked at the Caterpillar plant for 30 years. Her mother cleaned houses to help make ends meet. They'd raised their girls to be kind, hardworking, and proud of where they came from. Jennifer was all of those things. By 27, she was living on her own, renting a small apartment in a quiet complex on the east side. She wasn't wealthy, but she was independent. She paid her bills on time, kept her place clean, and had started talking about going back to school. She wanted to be a dental hygienist. She wanted to build something stable. On the evening of February 11th, Jennifer had come home from work around 5:30 p.m. She'd stopped at the grocery store on the way, picking up milk, bread, a box of spaghetti. Her neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Kowalski, saw her in the hallway carrying her bags. They exchanged pleasantries. Jennifer mentioned she was going to watch a movie that night, something light. She seemed fine. She seemed normal. That was the last time anyone saw her alive, except for one person. When Decatur police arrived at the apartment complex that morning, they moved quickly but carefully. The scene was treated as a homicide from the start. Detective Paul Mercer, a 20-year veteran of the department, was assigned as lead investigator. He was methodical, known for his patience and his ability to read people. He would need both. Inside apartment 2B, the forensic team worked in silence. Photographs were taken from every angle. Fingerprints were lifted from doorknobs, light switches, the kitchen counter. The apartment was small, a living room, a kitchenette, a bedroom, a bathroom. Nothing appeared to be missing. Jennifer's purse sat on the counter, her wallet still inside. Her keys were on a hook by the door. There were no signs of forced entry. The medical examiner arrived within the hour. Preliminary observations confirmed what the paramedics had suspected: Jennifer had been strangled. Manually. No ligature. Someone had used their hands. The bruising pattern suggested the attacker had been facing her, close enough to see her eyes. That detail haunted Mercer from the beginning. Strangulation is an intimate crime. It requires sustained effort, physical contact, time. It's not a crime of sudden rage, not typically. It's deliberate. The person who killed Jennifer Harmon had been in her apartment, close to her, for at least several minutes. And they had left almost no trace. Mercer spoke with Mrs. Kowalski first. She was still shaken, her hands trembling as she poured herself a cup of tea in her own apartment. She told Mercer she'd heard nothing unusual the night before. No shouting, no doors slamming, no footsteps in the hallway late at night. She'd gone to bed around 10 o'clock, and everything had seemed quiet. She mentioned seeing Jennifer come home the evening before. She looked fine, Mrs. Kowalski said, her voice soft. She smiled at me. She always smiled. Mercer asked if Jennifer had mentioned anyone visiting her. Mrs. Kowalski shook her head. She kept to herself mostly. Nice girl. Very nice. Other neighbors were interviewed throughout the day. No one had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. One resident mentioned seeing a car parked near the building late the night before, but couldn't describe it with any certainty. Another thought they'd heard a door close around midnight, but they weren't sure which apartment it came from. By the end of that first day, Mercer had more questions than answers. Who had been in Jennifer's apartment? How had they gotten in? And why had no one heard a thing? The autopsy was conducted the following morning. The medical examiner's report confirmed manual strangulation as the cause of death. Time of death was estimated between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. There were no defensive wounds on Jennifer's hands or arms. No skin under her fingernails. No signs she'd fought back. That absence troubled Mercer. It suggested one of two things: either Jennifer had been caught completely off guard, or she had known her attacker and hadn't seen the threat coming. The investigation moved quickly in those early days. Jennifer's family was devastated. Her mother, Carol, could barely speak when Mercer sat down with her. Her father, Raymond, sat rigid in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes red. Her sisters, Michelle and Laura, were beside themselves. They wanted to know who did this. They wanted to know why. Mercer asked them about Jennifer's life. Did she have a boyfriend? Any ex-boyfriends who might have been jealous or angry? Had she mentioned anyone making her uncomfortable? Carol shook her head. She wasn't seeing anyone, she said quietly. She'd broken up with someone about a year ago, but it was amicable. They just weren't right for each other. Michelle added that Jennifer had been focused on work and saving money. She was careful, Michelle said. She didn't take risks. She didn't go out to bars or meet strangers. She wasn't like that. Mercer made note of the ex-boyfriend's name, Tyler Grant. He would need to be interviewed. Jennifer's co-workers were interviewed next. Dr. Lawrence Fielding, the dentist she worked for, was visibly shaken. She was wonderful, he said. Reliable, kind, professional. Everyone loved her. The other staff members echoed the same sentiment. No one could think of anyone who would want to hurt Jennifer. She didn't have enemies. She didn't cause drama. She was just good. But someone had killed her. Tyler Grant was brought in for questioning 3 days after Jennifer's death. He was 29, an electrician who worked for a local contracting company. He and Jennifer had dated for about 8 months before breaking up the previous spring. He seemed genuinely shocked when Mercer told him what had happened. "I can't believe it," Tyler said, his voice hollow. I can't believe someone would do that to her." Mercer asked where he'd been on the night of February 11th. Tyler said he'd been home alone, watching TV. He lived by himself in a small rental house on the south side of town. No alibi. No one to confirm his story. "Did you have any contact with Jennifer recently?" Mercer asked. Tyler shook his head. "No. I mean, we were still friendly, but we didn't really talk anymore. It just didn't work out between us. There were no hard feelings." Mercer studied him. Tyler seemed sincere, but sincerity didn't rule anyone out. He asked if Tyler would be willing to provide fingerprints and a DNA sample. Tyler agreed without hesitation. Over the next several weeks, Tyler's story checked out. His fingerprints weren't found in Jennifer's apartment. His DNA didn't match anything collected at the scene. His finances showed no unusual activity, no recent purchases that suggested planning or panic. He had no history of violence, no prior arrests. And everyone who knew him said the same thing: Tyler was a good guy. Quiet, hardworking, not the type to hurt anyone. Mercer moved on. Other leads were pursued. Jennifer's phone records were pulled. She'd made a few calls in the days leading up to her death, mostly to her mother, her sister Michelle, a friend from work. Nothing unusual. No unknown numbers. No late-night calls that raised red flags. Her bank account showed regular activity. Rent, groceries, utilities, a small monthly transfer to savings. No large withdrawals. No signs of financial trouble. The forensic team found a partial fingerprint on the doorframe of Jennifer's bedroom, but it didn't match anything in the system. They found a few stray hairs that didn't belong to Jennifer, but DNA testing was still expensive and time-consuming in 1999, and the samples were too degraded to be useful immediately. Weeks turned into months. The investigation slowed. Mercer kept working the case, but he was also juggling other active investigations. Decatur wasn't a large city, but it had its share of crime, drug-related violence, domestic disputes, burglaries. Resources were limited. The department didn't have the manpower to dedicate to a single case indefinitely, no matter how tragic. By summer, the case had gone cold. To the people of Decatur, Jennifer Harmon's death became one of those stories everyone knew but no one talked about openly. It was whispered about in grocery store aisles, mentioned briefly at church gatherings, brought up when someone new moved into the apartment complex. People locked their doors a little more carefully for a while. Parents warned their daughters to be cautious. But eventually, life moved on. Jennifer's family didn't move on. Carol Harmon couldn't let go. She called the police department every few weeks, asking if there had been any progress. She made flyers with Jennifer's photo and a plea for information, posting them around town even though most people already knew the story. She attended city council meetings, asking for more resources to be dedicated to unsolved cases. Raymond withdrew into himself. He stopped going to church. He stopped socializing with old friends. He sat in his garage most evenings, staring at the walls, unable to shake the image of his youngest daughter lying on that apartment floor. Michelle and Laura tried to hold their parents together, but the grief was suffocating. Michelle started seeing a therapist. Laura threw herself into her job, working 12-hour days just to avoid thinking about it. Years passed. 1999 became 2000, then 2001. The world kept turning. September 11th happened, and the nation's attention shifted. Then wars, elections, economic downturns. Life in Decatur continued. People were born, people died, people moved away. But Jennifer Harmon's case file sat in a gray metal cabinet in the Decatur Police Department, gathering dust. Detective Paul Mercer never forgot about Jennifer. He couldn't. Her case haunted him in a way others didn't. He'd been a cop long enough to know that not every case gets solved, that sometimes the truth stays buried. But something about Jennifer's death felt unfinished, like a sentence cut off mid-thought. Over the years, Mercer would pull her file out every so often, usually late at night when the office was quiet. He'd flip through the reports, the witness statements, the autopsy photos. He'd go over the timeline again and again, looking for something he'd missed. But there was nothing. No obvious suspect, no clear motive, no smoking gun. In 2004, Mercer retired. He was 63, tired, ready to spend time with his grandchildren. But before he left, he made sure Jennifer's case was passed on to someone he trusted, Detective Angela Torres, a sharp, determined investigator who'd joined the department a few years earlier. Torres inherited a stack of cold cases, Jennifer's among them. She reviewed the file carefully, made a few follow-up calls, but there wasn't much to go on. The trail had gone cold years ago. Without new evidence or a witness coming forward, there was little she could do. Still, Torres kept the file on her desk. She didn't want Jennifer to be forgotten. By 2010, Jennifer Harmon's case was over a decade old. Carol Harmon was in her 70s now, her health declining. Raymond had passed away 2 years earlier from a heart attack. Michelle and Laura had families of their own, children who barely remembered their Aunt Jennifer except through old photographs and stories told at Thanksgiving. The case seemed destined to remain unsolved. But in small towns, secrets don't stay buried forever. They shift and settle like foundations under old houses, waiting for the right pressure to crack them open. In 2012, something changed. A woman named Diane Pritchard walked into the Decatur Police Department on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. She was in her early 50s, thin, with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. She asked to speak to someone about an old case. The officer at the front desk directed her to Detective Torres. Diane sat down across from Torres in a small interview room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked nervous, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and wasn't sure how to set it down. "I need to talk to you about Jennifer Harmon," Diane said quietly. Torres leaned forward. "Go on." Diane took a breath. "I think I know who killed her." The room seemed to shrink. Torres kept her voice calm, professional. "What makes you think that?" Diane hesitated, then spoke. "My ex-husband. His name is Kevin Pritchard. We were married back then, in 1999. He knew Jennifer. They worked together for a little while, at a restaurant downtown. I think he might have had feelings for her, but she wasn't interested. He got weird about it. Obsessive." Torres made notes. "Did you tell the police this back in 1999? Diane shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "No. I was scared. Kevin could be mean. He had a temper. I didn't want to believe he could do something like that. And I didn't have proof. I just had this feeling." "What changed?" Torres asked gently. Diane wiped her eyes. "We got divorced in 2008. I moved away for a while, tried to start over. But I couldn't shake it. I kept thinking about Jennifer, about her family. And then a few weeks ago, I ran into someone who used to know Kevin. They told me he'd been in trouble recently, arrested for assaulting his girlfriend. It made me think, what if I'd said something back then? What if I could have stopped this?" Torres let that sit for a moment. Then she asked, "Can you tell me anything specific about Kevin's behavior around the time of Jennifer's death?" Diane nodded slowly. "He came home late the night she was killed. Really late. Like 2 or 3 in the morning. I was asleep, but I woke up when I heard him come in. He was in the bathroom for a long time, running water. When he came to bed, his hands were shaking. I asked him where he'd been, and he told me he'd been out with a friend, lost track of time. But he wouldn't look at me." "Did you notice anything else?" Torres asked. Diane thought for a moment. "His clothes. He'd changed. The jeans he'd been wearing earlier were in the laundry the next morning, but I remember thinking they looked clean. Like he'd just washed them himself. And he was quieter than usual for a few days. Withdrawn." Torres made more notes. This was the most significant lead the case had seen in over a decade. Kevin Pritchard was 54 years old in 2012, living in a rundown duplex on the west side of Decatur. He'd worked a series of odd jobs over the years: construction, landscaping, warehouse work, never staying anywhere long. He had a record: a DUI in 2003, a disorderly conduct charge in 2006, and, as Diane had mentioned, a recent arrest for domestic assault. Torres and her partner, Detective Mark Brennan, decided to bring him in for questioning. They found him at home on a Thursday morning, sitting on his front porch smoking a cigarette. When they identified themselves, Kevin's expression didn't change. He seemed almost bored. "We'd like to ask you some questions about Jennifer Harmon," Torres said. Kevin took a drag from his cigarette. "Who?" "Jennifer Harmon. She was killed in 1999. You knew her?" Kevin shrugged. "I knew a lot of people. We'd appreciate it if you'd come down to the station," Brennan said. Kevin stubbed out his cigarette. "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet," Torres said evenly. Kevin stood up slowly. "Fine. Let's get this over with." At the station, Kevin was placed in an interview room. Torres and Brennan sat across from him, a recorder running between them. Kevin slouched in his chair, arms crossed. "Tell us about Jennifer Harmon," Torres began. Kevin looked at the ceiling. "I worked with her for a few months at a restaurant. O'Malley's, I think. Long time ago. She was a waitress. I was a cook. Did you two get along?" "Sure. She was nice. Everyone liked her." "Did you ever see her outside of work?" Kevin's jaw tightened slightly. "No." "Are you sure?" "Yeah, I'm sure." Torres leaned forward. "Kevin, we have reason to believe you had an interest in Jennifer. Maybe more than just co-workers." Kevin's eyes flicked to hers. "Who told you that? Does it matter?" Kevin sat up straighter. "I didn't kill her, if that's what you're getting at." "Where were you the night she died?" Brennan asked. Kevin paused. "I don't remember. That was over 10 years ago." "Your ex-wife remembers," Torres said. "She said you came home late that night. Around 2 or 3 in the morning. She said you seemed upset." Kevin's face hardened. "Diane's a liar. She's been trying to mess with me since the divorce." "Why would she lie about that?" Torres asked. "Because she hates me," Kevin said flatly. "She'll say anything to make me look bad." Torres and Brennan pressed him for the next hour, but Kevin didn't budge. He denied knowing Jennifer well, denied ever being at her apartment, denied having any involvement in her death. He refused to provide a DNA sample, citing his right to an attorney. By the end of the interview, they had to let him go. There wasn't enough evidence to hold him. But Torres wasn't done. Over the next several months, she and Brennan dug into Kevin Pritchard's past. They spoke with former co-workers, ex-girlfriends, people who'd known him in 1999. A pattern emerged. Kevin had a history of becoming fixated on women who showed him kindness. A co-worker at the restaurant remembered him talking about Jennifer constantly, how pretty she was, how sweet. Another former co-worker said Kevin had asked Jennifer out once, and she'd politely declined. He'd seemed fine about it at the time, but he'd continued bringing her up in conversation for weeks afterward. One of Kevin's ex-girlfriends described him as controlling and jealous. He couldn't handle rejection, she said. If he thought someone was ignoring him or looking down on him, he'd spiral. He'd get angry, vindictive. Torres also looked into Kevin's whereabouts on the night of Jennifer's death. His old work schedule showed he'd gotten off his shift at O'Malley's at 10 p.m. on February 11, 1999. The restaurant was less than a mile from Jennifer's apartment. The pieces were starting to fit. In early 2013, Torres made a decision. She requested a warrant to search Kevin Pritchard's current residence and to collect a DNA sample. Given his prior arrests and the emerging circumstantial evidence, a judge approved it. The search was conducted on a gray morning in March. Kevin wasn't home, he was at work. Torres and a forensic team went through the duplex methodically. They didn't find much of immediate value. Kevin didn't keep many personal items. But they did find something interesting, an old shoebox in the back of a closet. Inside were photographs. Most were of various women, candid shots taken from a distance. Some were clearly from the late 1990s, judging by the clothing and hairstyles. And near the bottom of the box, there was a photograph of Jennifer Harmon. She was standing outside O'Malley's, wearing her work uniform, smiling at someone off camera. The photo was slightly worn, like it had been handled many times. Torres held the photograph carefully. This wasn't proof of murder. But it was proof of obsession. When Kevin returned home that evening to find his door marked with a search warrant, he was furious. He called his attorney immediately, demanding to know what was going on. The attorney told him to say nothing, do nothing, and wait. But Kevin was rattled. The DNA sample collected during the search was sent to the state crime lab. In 2013, DNA testing had advanced significantly since 1999. The degraded hair samples found in Jennifer's apartment, which had been deemed too poor for analysis years earlier, were re-examined using newer techniques. It took 3 months for the results to come back. On a humid afternoon in late June, Torres received a call from the lab. The DNA from one of the hairs found in Jennifer's apartment was a match to Kevin Pritchard. Torres felt her heart pound. This was it. But there was a complication. The hair had been found near the bedroom doorframe, not on Jennifer's body or anywhere directly tied to the act of strangulation. Kevin's attorney would argue that it proved nothing. Kevin could have been in that apartment at some other time, for some other reason. It wasn't definitive proof of murder. Torres knew she needed more. She decided to try one more time to talk to Kevin, this time with the DNA evidence in hand. She wanted to see how he'd react. On July 9, 2013, Torres and Brennan brought Kevin in for another interview. This time, he came with his attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Richard Hollis. Torres laid out the evidence calmly. The DNA match. The photograph. The testimony from people who'd known Kevin in 1999. The timeline that placed him near Jennifer's apartment the night she died. Kevin sat stone-faced, his arms crossed. Hollis advised him not to respond. But Torres pressed. Kevin, we know you were there. We know you knew Jennifer. We know you had feelings for her. What happened that night? Kevin's jaw clenched. Did you go to her apartment? Torres asked. Did you just want to talk? Did things get out of hand? Kevin looked at his attorney, who shook his head firmly. Torres softened her voice. Kevin, this has been sitting on you for 14 years. That's a long time to carry something like this. For a moment, Kevin's expression flickered. Just for a second, something broke through, pain, guilt, anger, it was hard to say. But then he looked away, his face hardening again. I'm done talking, Kevin said. The interview ended. Torres and Brennan walked out of the room frustrated but not defeated. They knew they were close. They just needed one more push. That push came from an unexpected source. A week later, Torres received a call from a woman named Lisa Carmichael. Lisa had been Kevin's girlfriend briefly in 2010. She'd heard through a mutual friend that the police were looking into Kevin for a murder from years ago, and she wanted to talk. Torres met Lisa at a coffee shop downtown. Lisa was nervous, fidgeting with her cup. I didn't think much of it at the time, Lisa said quietly. But there was this one night, we'd been drinking, and Kevin got really drunk. He started talking about a woman he used to know. He didn't say her name, but he said she'd rejected him, made him feel like he was nothing. He said he'd gone to her apartment one night to try to explain himself, to make her understand. But she wouldn't listen. Torres leaned in. What else did he say? Lisa swallowed hard. He said things got heated. He said she tried to make him leave, and he snapped. He didn't say exactly what happened, but the way he talked about it, it sounded like he'd hurt her. I asked him what he meant, and he shut down. He told me to forget it, said he was just drunk and rambling. Why didn't you report this at the time? Torres asked gently. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. I didn't think he was serious. And I was scared. Kevin had a temper. I broke up with him not long after that. I didn't want to get involved. Torres thanked Lisa for coming forward. This wasn't a full confession, but it was close. Combined with the DNA evidence and the other circumstantial details, it was enough. On August 15, 2013, the Macon County State's Attorney's Office authorized an arrest warrant for Kevin Pritchard on charges of first-degree murder. Torres and Brennan picked him up at his workplace, a landscaping company on the outskirts of town. Kevin didn't resist. He didn't say a word. He just stared straight ahead as they cuffed him and led him to the squad car. For the first time in over 14 years, someone was being held accountable for Jennifer Harmon's death. The news spread through Decatur quickly. Jennifer Harmon's case, which had been all but forgotten by many, was suddenly front-page news again. The local paper ran a story with Jennifer's photo on the cover, along with a picture of Kevin Pritchard being escorted into the courthouse. Carol Harmon, now 76 and frail, broke down when Torres called to tell her about the arrest. She'd waited so long for this moment, and now that it was here, the emotions were overwhelming: relief, grief, anger, exhaustion all tangled together. Michelle and Laura flew back to Decatur to be with their mother. They stood together on the courthouse steps a few days later, Michelle reading a brief statement to the press. "Our sister Jennifer was a kind, loving person who didn't deserve what happened to her," Michelle said, her voice shaking. "For 14 years, we've lived with the pain of not knowing who took her from us. Today, we finally have an answer. We're grateful to Detective Torres and everyone who never gave up on Jennifer's case. We hope that justice will finally be served." The pre-trial process was slow. Kevin's attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the DNA could have been left innocently, that the statements from Lisa Carmichael were hearsay. But the prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorney Maria Sanchez, built a compelling case. They presented the timeline: Kevin's shift ending at 10 p.m., Jennifer being seen alive at 5:30 p.m., her death occurring sometime between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. They presented the DNA evidence, the photograph found in Kevin's possession, the testimony of people who described his obsession with Jennifer. They presented Lisa Carmichael's account of Kevin's drunken near confession. Kevin's defense tried to poke holes in the case. They argued that Kevin had been at Jennifer's apartment before, perhaps visiting as a friend, which would explain the DNA. They argued that the photograph proved nothing more than a crush. They argued that Lisa's testimony was unreliable. But the jury saw through it. The trial took place in the spring of 2015. It lasted 3 weeks. Carol Harmon attended every day, sitting in the front row with Michelle and Laura on either side of her. She watched Kevin Pritchard closely, looking for some sign of remorse, some acknowledgement of what he'd done. She saw nothing. Kevin sat impassively throughout most of the trial, his face blank. Only once did he show emotion, when Lisa Carmichael took the stand and recounted their conversation from 2010. Kevin's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists. But he didn't look at her. On the 12th day of the trial, the prosecution called its final witness, Detective Angela Torres. She walked the jury through the investigation, the years of dead ends, the moment Diane Pritchard walked into the station, the painstaking work of building the case. She spoke calmly, professionally, but there was an undercurrent of emotion in her voice. Jennifer Harmon deserved better, Torres said at one point. She deserved to live her life, to follow her dreams, to be safe in her own home. And her family deserved answers. That's what we've tried to give them. If you believe Jennifer deserved someone to keep fighting for the truth, hit the subscribe button. That fight doesn't end when the case is closed. It continues every time we refuse to forget. The defense rested without calling Kevin to the stand. His attorney likely knew that putting Kevin in front of the jury would do more harm than good. Closing arguments took place on a rainy Friday afternoon. Maria Sanchez addressed the jury with quiet intensity. "This case is about a man who couldn't handle rejection," she said. "A man who became fixated on a young woman who was simply trying to live her life." Jennifer Harmon was kind to Kevin Pritchard. She worked with him. She was polite. And when he asked her out, she said no, kindly, respectfully. But that wasn't enough for Kevin. He couldn't accept it. So on the night of February 11, 1999, he went to her apartment. Maybe he wanted to talk. Maybe he wanted to convince her. But when she refused him again, when she tried to make him leave, he killed her. Sanchez paused, letting that sink in. The evidence is clear. The DNA places him in her apartment. The witness testimony confirms his obsession. And his own words, spoken in a drunken moment years later, reveal his guilt. Jennifer Harmon died because Kevin Pritchard believed he was entitled to her attention, her affection, her time. He wasn't. And now, after 16 years, it's time for him to be held accountable. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the afternoon of the second day, they returned with a verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Carol Harmon closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. Michelle and Laura held each other, their shoulders shaking. Behind them, friends and supporters who'd followed the case quietly wept. Kevin Pritchard showed no reaction. He stared straight ahead, his expression empty. Sentencing took place 3 weeks later. Under Illinois law, first-degree murder carried a sentence of 20 to 60 years. Given the circumstances of the crime and Kevin's lack of remorse, the judge sentenced him to 50 years in prison. "Mr. Pritchard," the judge said, looking directly at him, "you took a life that was not yours to take. You robbed Jennifer Harmon of her future, and you robbed her family of decades of joy and love. You have shown no remorse, no accountability, no recognition of the harm you've caused. This sentence reflects the severity of your actions." Kevin was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He didn't look back. Outside the courthouse, Carol Harmon stood with her daughters and spoke briefly to the gathered reporters. "I never thought I'd see this day," Carol said, her voice trembling. "I thought I'd die without knowing who killed my Jennifer. But Detective Torres and everyone who worked on this case didn't give up. They kept going, even when it seemed impossible. I'm so grateful." Michelle added, "This doesn't bring Jennifer back. Nothing will. But it gives us some peace, knowing that the person responsible can't hurt anyone else." The case made headlines across Illinois and beyond. It was held up as an example of the importance of perseverance in cold case investigations, of the value of new forensic techniques, and of the courage it takes for witnesses to come forward even years after the fact. But for the people of Decatur, it was something simpler. It was justice, finally, for one of their own. Jennifer Harmon had been dead for 16 years. Her case had been cold for most of that time. Her killer had walked free, living his life, while her family suffered in silence. But the truth had a way of surfacing, even when buried under years of silence and fear. Kevin Pritchard's arrest and conviction didn't erase the pain. It didn't undo what had happened. But it mattered. It mattered because it said that Jennifer's life had value. That her death wasn't just a tragedy to be filed away and forgotten. That someone, somewhere, cared enough to keep digging, to keep asking questions, to refuse to let the case die. And it mattered because it reminded people that justice, while slow and imperfect, is still possible. In the years after the trial, Carol Harmon's health continued to decline. She passed away peacefully in 2018, at the age of 79. In her final days, she told her daughters she could finally rest, knowing that Jennifer's killer had been brought to justice. Michelle and Laura established a small scholarship fund in Jennifer's name, awarded annually to a young woman from Decatur pursuing a career in healthcare. It was a quiet way of keeping Jennifer's memory alive, of turning tragedy into something hopeful. Detective Angela Torres continued working cold cases for several more years before retiring in 2020. She kept a photograph of Jennifer Harmon on her desk until the day she left. In interviews, she often spoke about the importance of never giving up, of believing that every victim deserves someone fighting for them, no matter how much time has passed. "Jennifer's case taught me something I carry with me every day," Torres said in an interview with a local news station a year after the trial. "It taught me that time doesn't erase responsibility. That the truth is always there, waiting to be uncovered. And that families who've lost someone deserve more than sympathy, they deserve answers." Kevin Pritchard is currently serving his sentence at Menard Correctional Center in southern Illinois. He'll be eligible for parole in 2065, when he'll be 106 years old. In practical terms, it's a life sentence. He has never publicly admitted to killing Jennifer Harmon. He has never apologized to her family. Even in prison, he maintains his silence, perhaps believing that by refusing to speak, he can somehow maintain control over the narrative. But the silence doesn't change what happened. It doesn't erase the DNA evidence, the witness testimony, the jury's verdict. And it doesn't diminish the fact that on a cold February morning in 1999, a 27-year-old woman with her whole life ahead of her was strangled to death by a man who believed he was entitled to something she'd never offered him. The apartment complex where Jennifer lived still stands on the east side of Decatur. It's been renovated since then, repainted, the parking lot repaved. New families have moved in, unaware of the tragedy that took place in apartment 2B all those years ago. Life continues there, as it does everywhere, moving forward whether we're ready or not. But in the lobby of the dental office where Jennifer worked, there's a small plaque on the wall. It's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. It reads, "In memory of Jennifer Lynn Harmon. February 15, 1971 to February 12, 1999. A light in this office and in our hearts." Dr. Fielding, now retired, made sure it was installed the year after the trial. He wanted people to remember her, not as a victim of a terrible crime, but as the warm, kind person she'd been. She made people feel seen, Dr. Fielding said when the plaque was unveiled. That was her gift. She paid attention. She cared. And the world lost something precious when she died. Looking back at Jennifer Harmon's case, it's impossible not to think about all the ways it could have gone differently. If Diane Pritchard had come forward in 1999 instead of 2012, would the case have been solved sooner? If DNA technology had been more advanced in the months immediately after Jennifer's death, would the degraded hair samples have yielded results right away? If Lisa Carmichael hadn't felt comfortable enough to share what Kevin told her, would he have ever been caught? These questions don't have clean answers. Investigations don't follow neat paths. They're messy, full of missed opportunities and lucky breaks, dependent on the courage of witnesses and the persistence of detectives and the unpredictable way evidence surfaces over time. But Jennifer's case also illustrates something important about cold cases in general: they're never truly closed until someone decides they are. As long as the file exists, as long as someone is willing to pick it up and read through it one more time, there's a chance for resolution. Detective Paul Mercer, who passed away in 2016, never got to see Kevin Pritchard convicted. But his careful documentation of the evidence in 1999, his methodical approach to the initial investigation, laid the groundwork for everything that came later. When Torres reopened the case, she was building on his work, following the threads he'd carefully preserved. In that sense, Jennifer's case was solved not by one person or one breakthrough, but by a chain of people who refused to let her be forgotten. Mercer, who kept her file close. Torres, who saw the case as more than just paperwork. Diane Pritchard, who finally found the courage to speak up. Lisa Carmichael, who came forward even though it frightened her. The forensic technicians who re-examined old evidence with new tools. The prosecutors who built a case out of fragments and perseverance. Each of them played a part. Each of them mattered. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Justice doesn't happen automatically. It requires people, ordinary, flawed, determined people, who decide that someone's life mattered enough to keep trying. Jennifer Harmon mattered. She mattered to her parents, who raised her with love and watched her grow into a kind, thoughtful young woman. She mattered to her sisters, who lost not just a sibling but a friend. She mattered to her co-workers, who felt the absence of her smile every day after she died. She mattered to the patients at the dental office, who'd felt at ease in her presence. She mattered to her community, which was shaken by her death and quietly relieved when justice was finally served. And she mattered to the detectives who spent years trying to find out who killed her, who stayed up late reading through old files, who knocked on doors and asked difficult questions, who refused to accept that some cases are just meant to remain unsolved. The years between 1999 and 2015 were long. They were filled with grief and frustration, with dead ends and false hope, with the slow, grinding work of investigation and the even slower passage of time. For Jennifer's family, those years were marked by holidays without her, milestones she'd never reach, grandchildren she'd never meet. The pain didn't lessen with time, it just changed shape, becoming something they learned to carry. But when Kevin Pritchard was finally arrested, when the jury read their verdict, when the judge handed down the sentence, something shifted. Not healing, exactly. Not closure in the neat, simple way people sometimes imagine it. But something like acknowledgement. A recognition that Jennifer's life had been taken unjustly, and that there were consequences for that. It didn't bring her back. Nothing could. But it meant she hadn't been forgotten. And in a world where so many victims slip through the cracks, where so many cases go cold and stay that way, where so many families never get answers, that meant everything. Today, if you drive through Decatur, Illinois, you'll see a town that looks much like it did in 1999. The factories still hum along the industrial corridor. People still go to work, raise their families, live their lives. The seasons change, winter giving way to spring, summer to fall. The routines continue. But beneath the surface, the town carries its history. The crimes that were committed, the losses that were endured, the justice that was, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, achieved. Jennifer Harmon is buried in Graceland Cemetery on the north side of town, next to her father. Her headstone is simple, gray granite with her name and dates carved in clean letters. People still visit occasionally, her sisters, old friends, Detective Torres once a year on the anniversary of the arrest. Flowers are left there sometimes. Small bouquets, nothing elaborate. Just a quiet reminder that someone remembers. Someone cares. The case of Jennifer Lynn Harmon is officially closed. The investigation is complete. The trial is over. The appeals have been exhausted. Kevin Pritchard sits in his cell, and Jennifer rests in the ground, and the world keeps turning. But the story doesn't end there. It lives on in the people who knew her, in the detectives who worked her case, in the journalists who wrote about it, in the true crime enthusiasts who research cold cases and keep the names of victims alive in public memory. It lives on in the scholarship fund that bears her name, in the young women who receive it and go on to become nurses and dental hygienists and healthcare workers who carry forward that same spirit of kindness and care that Jennifer embodied. It lives on in the changes that were made in the Decatur Police Department after her case was solved, the renewed emphasis on cold case investigations, the improved evidence storage protocols, the training programs for detectives handling long-dormant cases. And it lives on in the quiet reminder to all of us that justice, while imperfect and often painfully slow, is still worth fighting for. That the truth matters. That victims deserve to be remembered as people, not just as cases. That families deserve answers. That detectives who refuse to give up can make a difference. That even after 16 years, after countless dead ends, after hope has faded and the trail has gone cold, sometimes, somehow, the truth finds its way to the surface. Jennifer Harmon was 27 years old when she died. She had dreams she'd never fulfill, places she'd never travel, people she'd never meet. Her life was cut short by an act of senseless violence, by a man who believed his desires mattered more than her safety, her autonomy, her right to simply exist without fear. But her story didn't end with her death. It continued in the people who loved her, in the investigators who fought for her, in the community that never quite forgot her name. And now, years later, when someone searches for cold cases from Illinois, when they read about murders that were solved decades after they occurred, they'll find Jennifer's story. They'll learn about the quiet receptionist who was kind to everyone. They'll read about the long investigation, the witness who finally came forward, the detective who wouldn't give up. They'll see the photograph of her smiling outside O'Malley's restaurant, young and alive and full of possibility. And maybe, just maybe, they'll remember that behind every case number, every cold file, every victim's name carved on a headstone, there's a person who mattered. A life that had value. A family that deserved answers. Justice arrived late for Jennifer Harmon. But it arrived. And that has to mean something. The people who stay for stories like this are exactly the ones this channel exists for. You already understand why these stories matter. You know that victims like Jennifer deserve more than to be forgotten, that cases like hers deserve to be told with care and respect, that the long road to justice, however difficult, however painful, is a road worth traveling. This channel is dedicated to bringing you those stories. The cases that took years or decades to solve. The victims who were overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten. The families who refused to give up. The detectives who kept digging when everyone else had moved on. The moments when truth finally broke through layers of silence and time. If these stories resonate with you, if you believe that every victim deserves to be remembered, consider subscribing. Consider leaving a comment sharing where you're watching from, what cases you'd like to hear about, what stories have stayed with you. This community exists because people like you care about justice, about truth, about keeping the memory of victims alive. Cold cases matter. Not because they're puzzles to be solved or mysteries to entertain us, but because they represent real people whose lives were taken, real families who deserve answers, and real communities that need to know that violence has consequences. Jennifer Harmon's case is closed. But there are thousands more like hers still waiting. Cases sitting in file cabinets, gathering dust, waiting for someone to care enough to open them one more time. Families waiting for phone calls that may never come. Victims whose names have been forgotten by everyone except the people who loved them. Every time we tell these stories, every time we remember the victims, every time we acknowledge the hard work of the people who fought for justice, we push back against the silence that allows these crimes to fade into obscurity. We say, this person mattered. This life had value. This story deserves to be told. Jennifer Lynn Harmon was born on February 15, 1971, in Decatur, Illinois. She grew up in a loving home, surrounded by family who cared about her. She worked hard, treated people with kindness, and tried to build a life for herself. She had dreams. She had plans. She had a future. On February 12, 1999, all of that was taken from her. But her memory lives on. In her family. In her community. In the people who worked to find her killer. And now, in this story, shared with people around the world who believe that victims deserve justice and families deserve peace. Rest in peace, Jennifer Lynn Harmon. You were not forgotten. You will never be forgotten. Now if you haven't, please subscribe, like and share to a friend who'd love story like this. I'll see you in the next one.